June 22, 1953. The streets of Brooklyn were baking in the early summer heat. It was a Monday, the kind of unremarkable day that history usually forgets. In the bustling stairwell of an apartment building at 3403 Foster Avenue, a 13-year-old boy named Jimmy Bozart was collecting money for his paper route. He was a Brooklyn Eagle delivery boy, a job that in the 1950s was a rite of passage, a lesson in the economics of small change. Jimmy moved door to door, collecting quarters and dimes from the housewives and working men of the neighborhood. The transaction was routine until he knocked on the door of a customer who handed him payment. Jimmy felt the coins drop into his hand-heavy, warm metal. But as he turned to leave, scrambling down the stairs with the careless energy of a teenager, he tripped. The coins flew out of his hand and scattered across the concrete landing. The sound of change hitting stone is distinct a chaotic jingle of silver and copper. But among the ringing of the quarters and dimes, there was a strange, dull thud. Jimmy knelt to pick up his earnings. He grabbed a Jefferson nickel, dated 1948, but as his fingers closed around it, the coin didn't feel right. It felt light, and then, right before his eyes, the coin fell apart. The face of Thomas Jefferson separated from the Monticello building on the reverse. A tiny, circular piece of microfilm, no larger than a fingernail, fell out of the hollowed center and fluttered to the dirty floor. In that precise second, the Cold War changed. Jimmy Bozart stared at the object. He didn't know it, but he was looking at the holy grail of FBI counterintelligence. For years, Edgar Hoover's agents had suspected that Soviet illegals, deep-cover spies operating without diplomatic immunity, were swarming New York City. They had theories, they had defectors rumors, but they had zero physical evidence. They had never found a transmitter, a codebook, or a dead drop. And now, a 13-year-old boy, clumsy from the heat, had just accidentally cracked the Soviet Union's most secure communication system because he tripped on a staircase. The odds of this happening were astronomical. The nickel was designed to be indistinguishable from regular currency. It was meant to be passed from a KGB courier to a spy in a crowded subway station or a park bench hidden in plain sight. If Jimmy had spent the nickel at a candy store, it would have entered the massive circulation of the U.S. economy, lost forever. If he hadn't dropped it, he never would have noticed the weight difference. If it hadn't hit the concrete at the exact angle required to pop the friction seal, it would have remained closed. It was a 1 in a billion collision of bad luck for the KGB and blind luck for the United States. Jimmy was a smart kid. He knew about spies every kid in 1953 read comic books about G-men and communists. He picked up the microfilm and the two halves of the coin. He didn't tell the customer. He finished his route. Later, he told the daughter of a New York City police officer about his strange find. The officer, initially skeptical, took a look at the coin. He saw the microscopic drill work. He saw the precision of the threading. This wasn't a magic trick from a joke shop. It was machinery. He passed it to the NYPD, who passed it to the FBI. When the nickel arrived at the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to alarm. The technicians placed the nickel under high magnification microscopes. They were stunned by the craftsmanship. The coin was a genuine 1948 Jefferson nickel. The Soviets had taken a real U.S. coin and machined it out with a lathe of incredible precision. The face of the coin was drilled out to a depth of mere millimeters, leaving a shell so thin that a heavy touch could dent it. The reverse side was similarly hollowed. The two halves were threaded so they could screw together. The threading was so fine that the seam was invisible to the naked eye, but the real treasure was the film. It was a square of celluloid, measuring 5 millimeters by 5 millimeters. On it were 10 columns of typewritten numbers, 207 groups of 5 digits each. It was a cipher. The FBI's cryptanalysis section, the code lab, went to work. They expected to crack it in weeks. They were wrong. The hollow nickel would become the most frustrating cold case in the history of American code breaking. For 4 long years, the best mathematical minds in the Western world stared at those numbers, and the numbers refused to speak. The problem was the system. The numbers were encrypted using a one-time pad, OTP. In the world of cryptography, the one-time pad is the only theoretically unbreakable code. It works by generating a random key of numbers that is at least as long as the message itself. The sender adds the key to the message digits. The receiver, possessing the matching key, subtracts them. If the key is truly random and used only once, there is no mathematical pattern for a code breaker to find. No frequency analysis works because every number has an equal probability of appearing. Unless you have the key, the pad, you are just staring at random noise. The FBI didn't know for sure it was a one-time pad, but they suspected it. They tried everything. They ran the numbers through early mainframe computers. They tried to correlate the digits with known Soviet diplomatic traffic. They tried to match it against book codes, Bible verses, and technical manuals. Nothing worked. The nickel sat in an evidence locker, a mute witness to a crime the FBI couldn't solve. From 1953 to 1957, the investigation went nowhere. The FBI interviewed Jimmy Bozart multiple times, trying to trace where he had gotten the coin. Had a customer given it to him? Had he received it in change at a store? Jimmy couldn't remember. The coin had just appeared in his pocket, one of thousands of nickels moving through Brooklyn. The trail was cold before it even started. However, the FBI did learn something crucial from the coin itself. The microfilm wasn't just a random scrap. It was cut from a stock of film manufactured in the Soviet Union. The typeface used to type the numbers was from a Cyrillic typewriter, specifically a portable model often issued to intelligence officers. This proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there was an active Soviet spy ring operating in New York. They were here. They were communicating. And they were using dead drops passing information without ever meeting face to face. The hollow nickel case, file number 6560388, became an obsession for the Bureau. They started a massive, silent hunt for similar coins. Agents were sent to novelty shops, magic stores, and machine shops across New York, asking if anyone had ordered hollowed-out currency. They found nothing. The Soviets made their own tools. While the FBI hunted ghosts in Brooklyn, the man who had lost the nickel was living a life of quiet desperation. His name was Rhino Haywanen, codename Vic. He was not a master spy. He was, to put it bluntly, a disaster. Haywanen was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, sent to the United States to act as the assistant to the resident spy, the master known as Mark Rudolf Abel. Haywanen's job was to be the legman. He was supposed to locate drop sites, collect messages, and act as a courier. But Haywanen was unsuited for the pressure of espionage. He was an alcoholic. He beat his wife. He was lazy. And he was stealing from the KGB. The nickel that Jimmy Bozart found was meant for Haywanen. Or perhaps Haywanen had meant to pass it to someone else. The details of the drop were lost in the fog of Haywanen's incompetence. He had likely received the nickel in a bulk exchange of coins, or had carelessly spent it to buy a newspaper or a subway token, not realizing he was handing over a top-secret message from Moscow. Imagine the panic of a spy realizing he has spent a hollow coin. He couldn't go back and ask for it. He couldn't report it to his superiors without admitting gross negligence that would lead to his execution. So, Haywanen did what he always did. He kept his mouth shut, drank more vodka, and hoped the coin would disappear into the vast ocean of American currency. For 3 years, his luck held. But the pressure was mounting. His boss, Rudolf Abel, was growing increasingly frustrated with him. Abel was a professional, a disciplined, intellectual man who lived a Spartan life. Haywanen was a liability. Abel sent reports to Moscow complaining about VIK's behavior. He requested that Heywanen be recalled. In early 1957, the order came. Moscow messaged Heywanen, "Return home for leave and promotion." Heywanen wasn't stupid. He knew how the KGB worked. Leave and promotion for an incompetent spy usually meant a bullet in the back of the head in the basement of the Lubyanka prison. He knew that Abel had reported him. He knew about the missing money. He knew about the lost nickel, though he didn't know the FBI had it. Heywanen boarded the Queen Mary in New York, bound for Europe. He was supposed to travel to the Soviet Union via France. But as the ship crossed the Atlantic, terror took hold of him. He realized he was sailing toward his own execution. When he arrived in Paris, he made a decision that would finally unlock the mystery of Jimmy Bozart's coin. He didn't go to the Soviet embassy. He went to the American embassy. On a rainy morning in May 1957, a disheveled, hungover man walked into the U.S. Embassy in Paris. He looked like a vagrant. He smelled of alcohol. He demanded to see the ranking intelligence officer. The Marine guard at the desk was skeptical. "Who are you?" he asked. The man leaned in and whispered 5 words that changed history. "I am an officer of Soviet intelligence." The CIA officers who interviewed him were initially doubtful. Heywanen didn't look like a James Bond villain. He looked like a man who had slept in a park. But then, to prove his bona fides, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a hollow Finnish 5-mark coin. "I can tell you about the nickel," he said. "Back in Washington, the news hit the FB like a thunderbolt." The defector in Paris knew about the hollow coins. He admitted to being the courier who had lost the nickel in Brooklyn 4 years earlier. "The message," the FBI agents demanded. "What does the message say?" Heywanen shook his head. "I don't know. I couldn't read it, but I can give you the code." Heywanen didn't have the one-time pad for that specific message. It had been destroyed long ago, but he remembered the system. He explained how the KGB generated the keys based on a specific algorithm involving the date and a master password. He revealed that the message in the nickel was a personal greeting from Moscow to the new resident spy, welcoming him to New York. With Heywanen's help, the FBI cryptanalysts finally cracked the code of the Jimmy Bozart nickel. The message, decoded 4 years late, read, "We congratulate you on a safe arrival. We confirm the receipt of your letter to the address V repeat V and the reading of letter number 1. It was banal. It contained no nuclear secrets, no invasion plans. It was just administrative paperwork. But the content didn't matter. What mattered was that Heywanen could lead them to the man who was supposed to receive the messages. "Who is the resident?" the FBI asked. "Who is your boss?" Heywanen hesitated. He was terrified of Abel. Even across the ocean, the colonel's shadow loomed large. "I know him as Mark," Heywanen said. "He lives in Brooklyn. He is a painter. He is a genius." The investigation shifted instantly from a forensic puzzle to a manhunt. The FBI flew Heywanen back to the United States. They put him in a safe house. They drove him around Brooklyn, hoping he would recognize the streets. Heywanen's memory was foggy from years of alcohol abuse. He couldn't remember the exact address. He remembered it was near a park. He remembered a neon sign. The FBI agents were desperate. They had the key to the Soviet spy ring in their car, but he couldn't remember which door to unlock. Finally, Heywanen remembered something specific. "The studio," he said. "It is on the top floor, across from a building with a sign, and he stores his equipment in a storeroom nearby." The agents drove him street by street, and then he saw it. Fulton Street. "There," Heywanen pointed. "That is where Mark lives." The address was 252 Fulton Street. The FBI had found the lair. Now they had to find the dragon. But they still didn't know that Mark, Rudolf Abel, was already aware that something was wrong. The silence from Heywanen was suspicious. The master spy was preparing to run. The race was on. A race that began with a clumsy paperboy dropping a nickel was about to end in a confrontation between the FBI and the highest-ranking Soviet spy ever caught on American soil. This was no longer about a coin. It was about dismantling the entire infrastructure of Soviet espionage in North America. And it all hinged on whether the FBI could catch Abel before he realized that his incompetent, drunken assistant had sold him out for a plane ticket to freedom. The stage was set for the raid that would expose the fake life of the artist of Brooklyn. May 1957. The FBI surveillance teams set up a perimeter around 252 Fulton Street in Brooklyn. They were looking for a ghost. Rhino Hyowanen had described Mark as a man of average height, thin, balding, with an aquiline nose and a piercing intelligence that seemed to dissect everyone he met. But descriptions are cheap in the spy game. The FBI needed visual confirmation. For days, agents watching from unmarked cars and hidden observation posts saw nothing but the mundane rhythm of a working-class neighborhood. And then he appeared. A man matching the description exited the building. He walked with a distinctive gait alert, efficient, purposeful. He didn't look like a spy. He looked like a struggling artist. He wore baggy trousers and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. But his behavior was a textbook study in counter-surveillance. He stopped to look in shop windows, using the reflection to check the street behind him. He boarded subway cars at the last second, forcing anyone following him to scramble or be left behind. This was no amateur. This was a professional who had survived the purges of Stalin and the chaos of World War II. The FBI tailed him for weeks. They watched him go to Prospect Park, where he would sit on a bench, sketching the trees. But while he sketched, his eyes were scanning the area for dead drops hollowed-out bricks, magnetic containers under benches, signal marks chalked on lampposts. They watched him visit a music store, a camera shop, and the local library. Slowly, they built a profile of Emil R. Goldfoss, the name on the mailbox at the studio. To the neighbors, Goldfoss was a quiet, slightly eccentric photographer who paid his rent on time and kept to himself. To the FBI, he was the spider in the center of the web. But surveillance wasn't enough. They needed to connect him directly to the espionage paraphernalia Hyowanen had described. The breakthrough came when agents managed to covertly enter the studio while Abel was out. What they found inside was a stunning validation of the hollow nickel theory. The studio was a workshop for deception. They found a lathe-heavy, precision machine tool used for turning metal. This was the smoking gun. This was the machine that had likely carved the coin Jimmy Bozart dropped. They found hollowed-out bolts, cufflinks, and shaving brushes. They found a shortwave radio capable of receiving transmissions from Moscow. And most damning of all, they found a soft film cipher pad, a sheet of plastic impregnated with flammable chemicals that could be destroyed in seconds with a match. On June 21, 1957, the trap was sprung. Abel had moved to the Hotel Latham in Manhattan, perhaps sensing the heat in Brooklyn. The FBI, coordinating with the Inns to use an immigration violation as a pretext for detention, raided room 505. The arrest was anticlimactic in its violence, but monumental in its implications. Abel was taken into custody without a shot fired. As the agents tossed the room, searching for evidence, Abel sat calmly on the bed. He asked for his painting supplies. He asked for his mathematics books. He was already preparing for the long game of prison. The hollow nickel case had now moved from the streets to the laboratory. The FBI's forensic experts began the arduous task of reverse engineering Abel's life. Every object in his possession was a clue. A notebook found in the room contained a series of cryptic notations that looked like random scribbles. FBI cryptanalysts realized it was a map of the Soviet spy network in New York. The numbers corresponded. to specific lampposts and fence railings where signals were left. The Smith notation referred to a dead drop in Central Park. The Jack notation referred to a signal site in the Bronx. The investigation revealed the incredible sophistication of the Soviet illegal program. Abel wasn't just passing notes. He was running a technical support hub. He was manufacturing the containers that other spies used. He was the quartermaster of the underground. The hollow nickel wasn't a one-off. It was a mass-produced item in Abel's inventory. The FBI found evidence that he had created hollow coins of various denominations, pennies, dimes, quarters, each tailored for a specific agent or a specific type of message. The nickel that Jimmy Bozart found was just one defect in a factory line of perfect camouflage. But the most fascinating discovery was Abel's personal history, which the FBI pieced together from defectors and intelligence scraps. William Genrikhovich Fischer was born in England to Russian parents. He grew up speaking English with a slight accent, which explained how he could blend into New York so seamlessly. He was a man of immense talent, a linguist, a radio engineer, a photographer, a painter, and a mathematician. He was the Renaissance man of espionage. The tragedy of Abel was that his genius was dedicated to a system that treated him as an expendable asset. He lived a life of total isolation in New York, cut off from his wife and daughter in Russia, surrounding himself with fake friends and fake hobbies, all to serve a master thousands of miles away who communicated only in numbers. The trial of Rudolf Abel in October 1957 was a sensation. The public was fascinated by the hollow nickel spy. Jimmy Bozart, now a young man, was called as a witness. The prosecution presented the hollow nickel as Exhibit A. They showed the jury the microfilm. They brought in Rhino Haywanin, the drunken trader, to point the finger at his former boss. Haywanin's testimony was pathetic but damning. He whined about his low pay, his difficult working conditions, and Abel's strictness. In contrast, Abel sat in the defendant's chair with dignity. He never took the stand. He never spoke in his own defense. He let his lawyer, James Donovan, do the fighting. The defense strategy was unique. Donovan didn't try to prove Abel wasn't a spy. The evidence, the radio, the cipher pads, the hollow coins was overwhelming. Instead, Donovan humanized him. He portrayed Abel not as a monster, but as a soldier serving his country, just as an American spy would serve the United States. He argued that Abel shouldn't be executed because he was a valuable chip for a future trade. This argument, radical at the time, would save Abel's life. The jury found him guilty, but the judge, swayed by Donovan's logic, sentenced him to 30 years rather than the electric chair. The conviction of Rudolf Abel was a triumph for the FBI, but it left a lingering unease. The hollow nickel had been found by accident. How many other hollow coins were still circulating in the American economy? How many other Abels were living in quiet apartments in Chicago, Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C., machining nickels and waiting for signals? The case proved that the enemy was not just out there in the Soviet Union. The enemy was here, walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, and perhaps handing you a nickel in change that contained the secrets of the hydrogen bomb. The FBI launched a quiet campaign to alert the public without causing panic. They briefed banks and vending machine companies to look for light coins. They checked the coin sorting machines at the Federal Reserve. They found nothing. The Soviet tradecraft was too good. The Bozart nickel was a fluke, a lightning strike. The network had likely switched methods the moment the news broke. The nickels were gone, replaced by hollow rocks, magnetic bolts, and other containers that didn't have a face value. As Abel went to prison in Atlanta, the hollow nickel case officially closed. But the legend of the coin grew. It became a cautionary tale in the intelligence community. It taught counterintelligence agents that the biggest breaks often come from the smallest things. It taught them to listen to paperboys. and it taught the KGB a brutal lesson about the fragility of secrecy. A multi-million-dollar spy ring, run by their best colonel, protected by layers of lies and codes, had been brought down by a 13-year-old kid who tripped on a staircase. The irony was perfect. The Soviet Union, the dictatorship of the proletariat, had been defeated by a working-class American boy doing his job. The capture of Rudolf Abel did not end the story. It merely placed a valuable piece on the chessboard, waiting to be played, while the hollow nickel spy sat in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, teaching mathematics to fellow inmates and painting portraits of the warden. The geopolitical temperature outside the prison walls was rising to a boiling point. James Donovan, the lawyer who had saved Abel from the electric chair, had argued that the Russian colonel was an insurance policy. He had predicted that one day the United States would lose a spy of its own and would need someone of equal value to trade. For 3 years, that prediction seemed abstract, a lawyer's hypothetical. But on May 1st, 1960, the insurance policy was cashed in. The event that triggered it took place 70,000 feet above the Soviet Union, where the United States was betting its national security on a camera and a glider. The Central Intelligence Agency had been flying the U-2 spy plane over Russia with impunity since 1956. It was a technological marvel, a fragile dragonfly of an aircraft designed to fly so high that Soviet fighter jets stalled out trying to reach it, and anti-aircraft artillery exploded miles below it. The U-2 was the ultimate voyeur, its high-resolution cameras snapping pictures of missile silos and bomber bases, giving President Eisenhower the confidence that there was no bomber gap. But the Soviets were learning. They had developed the S-75DVINA, a surface-to-air missile that resembled a telephone pole packed with high explosives, capable of climbing into the stratosphere at Mach 3. On that May Day morning, pilot Francis Gary Powers was flying a mission-designated Grand Slam, a brazen flight path that cut straight across the heart of the USSR from Pakistan to Norway. Over Sverdlovsk, the luck of the CIA ran out. A Soviet missile battery locked onto Powers' aircraft. The first missile detonated behind the U-2, sending a shockwave that snapped the fragile wings off the glider. The plane didn't just crash. It disintegrated. Powers was pinned to the cockpit by G-forces, unable to activate the self-destruct mechanism that would have destroyed the sensitive cameras. He barely managed to bail out, tumbling into the freezing Russian air. When he hit the ground, he was alive. And in his pockets, the KGB found a collection of spy gear that mirrored the kit found in Abel's hotel room. A silenced pistol, maps, gold coins for bribery, and a hollow silver dollar containing a needle laced with saxitoxin, a suicide device. The symmetry was perfect. The Americans had caught a Soviet spy because of a hollow nickel. The Soviets had caught an American spy carrying a hollow silver dollar. The coin war had claimed a victim on both sides. When the news of Powers' capture broke, it humiliated the United States. President Eisenhower had initially lied, claiming a NASA weather plane had gone missing. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev waited for the lie to take root, then produced the pilot and the wreckage, exposing the deception to the world. In Atlanta, Rudolf Abel heard the news on the prison radio. He reportedly smiled. He knew exactly what this meant. The dynamics of his imprisonment had just shifted from punishment to negotiation. He was no longer a convict. He was currency. James Donovan received a call. The government that had once shunned him for defending a red spy now needed him to save their pilot. The CIA asked Donovan to travel to East Berlin to negotiate the exchange. It was a mission of extreme danger. Donovan would be traveling as a private citizen without diplomatic immunity. If he was arrested or killed, the U.S. government would disavow him. He was walking into the epicenter of the Cold War, a city that had just been sliced in half by the Berlin Wall. The situation in Berlin was chaotic. The wall was fresh, a jagged scar of concrete and barbed wire. The East German government, the GDR, was desperate for international recognition. They saw the spy swap not just as a trade, but as an opportunity to force the United States to acknowledge them as a sovereign nation. To complicate matters, the East Germans had arrested another American, a Yale economics student named Frederick Pryor, accusing him of espionage. Pryor was innocent, a student in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he became a pawn in the negotiation. The CIA wanted powers. They were willing to trade Abel for the pilot. They viewed the student as collateral damage. Donovan refused to play by that calculus. He insisted on a 2-for-1 deal, Abel for both Powers and Pryor. The negotiations were a grueling psychological marathon, played out in shadowy offices and the back seats of cars in East Berlin. Donovan had to bluff the KGB, telling them that unless they released the student, the United States would keep Abel. He knew the Soviets were desperate to get their colonel back. Abel had kept his silence for 5 years. The KGB wanted to bring him home before his health failed or his resolve cracked. They regarded him as a hero, a scout who had served the motherland in the belly of the beast. They didn't care about the student, but they had to pressure their East German puppets to release him to get their man. The deal was finally struck for the morning of February 10, 1962. It would be a synchronized exchange at 2 different locations. Frederick Pryor would be released at Checkpoint Charlie in the city center. Francis Gary Powers and Rudolf Abel would be swapped at the Glienicke Bridge, a secluded steel structure spanning the Havel River on the outskirts of Potsdam. The bridge was the perfect stage for the drama isolated, often shrouded in fog, and connecting the American sector of West Berlin with the Soviet zone. On the day of the exchange, the bridge was frozen and gray. American snipers watched from the rooftops. On the east side, a convoy of Soviet limousines appeared. On the west side, James Donovan stood with Rudolf Abel. The 2 men, lawyer and spy, had developed a strange respect for each other. Donovan asked Abel if he was worried about what awaited him in Moscow. Would he be hailed as a hero or shot as a traitor? Abel shrugged. He said that if he was embraced, it would be fine. If he was sent to the rear, it would be bad. It was the stoicism of a man who had lived his entire life on a razor's edge. The tension was excruciating. Donovan refused to release Abel until he received confirmation that Pryor had been released at Checkpoint Charlie. The CIA agents on the bridge were furious, checking their watches, terrified the deal would collapse. But Donovan held the line. Finally, the signal came. The student was free. The walk began. Rudolf Abel walked toward the east. Francis Gary Powers walked toward the west. They passed each other in the middle of the bridge, 2 men who had never met, but whose lives were irrevocably binded by the tradecraft of hollow coins and hidden cameras. The exchange at the Glienicke Bridge remains one of the most iconic moments of the Cold War, but its direct link to the streets of Brooklyn is often overlooked. Without Jimmy Bozart dropping that nickel in 1953, the FBI would never have caught Abel. Without Abel in prison, the United States would have had nothing to trade for Powers. A pilot would likely have spent 20 years in a Soviet gulag or been executed. The hollow nickel was the butterfly effect in action. A clumsy teenager tripping on a staircase had set in motion a chain of events that saved the life of a U-2 pilot and brought a master spy home to Moscow. But while the politicians and generals congratulated themselves on the bridge, the forensic impact of the case was just beginning to be understood. The hollow nickel investigation had revealed a terrifying truth to American counterintelligence. The physical objects of the world could no longer be trusted. The FBI realized that the Soviets had weaponized the mundane. If a nickel could be a spy, what else? This paranoia fueled a massive expansion in technical surveillance countermeasures. The FBI began X-raying mail, disassembling office equipment, and scanning the electromagnetic spectrum with a new intensity. The case birthed the modern era of technical surveillance countermeasures, TSCM. The investigation also highlighted the role of the illegal. Abel was a new kind of threat, a spy who didn't work out of an embassy, who didn't have diplomatic cover, who lived next door. He was Emil Goldfoss, the photographer. He was the man you said hello to in the elevator. The realization that the enemy was embedded in the fabric of American life fueled the Red Scare, giving credence to the idea that spies were everywhere. But unlike the McCarthyite witch hunts, which targeted people for their beliefs, the hollow nickel case targeted people for their tradecraft. It proved that real spies didn't look like villains. They looked like your neighbors. For the paperboy, Jimmy Bozart, the aftermath was strange. He was given a reward, but his role was largely a footnote in the grand drama of the bridge exchange. Yet, in the intelligence community, he is a legend. He represents the X factor, the element of pure chance that no amount of KGB planning could account for. William Fischer had trained for decades. He had mastered codes, radios, and photography. He had lived a double life without making a mistake. But he couldn't plan for a loose grip and a hard floor. The collapse of his network proved that in the world of espionage, the greatest enemy isn't the FBI or the CIA, it's gravity. As Abel returned to Moscow, he was treated as a quiet hero. He was never publicly acknowledged as a spy during his lifetime, but he was awarded the Order of Lenin. He spent his remaining years training the next generation of illegals, teaching them how to be invisible. He likely told them the story of the nickel, not as a failure, but as a lesson in the cruelty of chance. He died in 1971. Francis Gary Powers died in a helicopter crash in 1977, but the nickel remains. It sits in the FBI museum today, a tiny tarnished piece of metal that bought the freedom of two men and defined a generation of spycraft. It is a monument to the fact that secrets are heavy, and if you drop them, they tend to break open. The exchange at Gleneek Bridge closed the case file on Rudolf Abel, but it opened a new chapter in the history of espionage that is still being written today. The hollow nickel case became the textbook definition of the Black Swan event in counterintelligence, an unpredictable, high-impact incident that defies all planning. For the FBI, the lesson was terrifying. They had caught the highest-ranking Soviet spy in America, not because their dragnet was tight, but because luck was on their side. This realization forced a massive, invisible restructuring of American internal security. If a master spy could live in Brooklyn for years, paying taxes, painting bridges, and chatting with neighbors, who else was out there? The FBI launched the Illegal Status Program, a dedicated unit tasked solely with hunting deep-cover agents who had no diplomatic immunity. They began to look not for stolen documents, but for the anomalies in the fabric of ordinary life, the radio transmission bursts that lasted milliseconds, the bank accounts that had no clear origin, and the dead drops that appeared in suburbia. The nickel had proven that the enemy wasn't just at the gates. The enemy was already inside, and he had a key. While Rudolf Abel returned to Moscow, to a hero's welcome, albeit a quiet, classified one Francis Gary Powers faced a homecoming defined by suspicion and coldness. The pilot who had fallen from the edge of space was treated not as a survivor, but as a liability. A Central Intelligence Agency sequestered him for weeks, subjecting him to aggressive debriefings that bordered on interrogation. They analyzed his every word during his Soviet captivity, looking for signs of brainwashing or betrayal. The American public, fueled by the embarrassment of the incident, viewed him with skepticism. Why hadn't he used the saxitoxin needle? Why was he alive when the plane had disintegrated? Powers was the victim of a culture that preferred dead heroes to living complications. He was eventually cleared by a Senate inquiry, which determined he had followed orders and behaved with integrity. But the stigma of the man who didn't die followed him for the rest of his life. The tragedy of Powers' life concluded in a way that felt like a cruel footnote to his high-altitude past. After leaving the CIA, he struggled to find work. The most experienced spy pilot in the world was eventually reduced to flying a traffic helicopter for a Los Angeles television station. On August 1, 1977, while covering brush fires in Santa Barbara, his helicopter ran out of fuel and crashed, killing him instantly. He was 47 years old. It wasn't until the year 2000, decades after his death and the end of the Cold War, that the U.S. Air Force finally awarded him the Prisoner of War Medal and the Silver Star. The ceremony was a posthumous apology, an admission that the government had scapegoated a man for the crime of surviving the impossible. Powers had been a pawn in a game played by men who never left the ground, and his redemption came only when it no longer mattered to him. James Donovan, the lawyer who had brokered the deal, found that his work on the Bridge of Spies was merely the audition for a larger stage. President John F. Kennedy, recognizing Donovan's unique ability to negotiate with enemies without blinking, recruited him for a mission that seemed even more impossible than the Abel exchange. Kennedy sent Donovan to Cuba to negotiate with Fidel Castro for the release of the 1,113 prisoners captured during the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. Donovan spent months in Havana, arguing, cajoling, and building a strange rapport with the communist dictator. He used the same logic he had applied to the Abel case. Human life is a resource, and wasting it is bad politics. Donovan succeeded where the State Department had failed, securing the release of every single prisoner, along with thousands of their family members, in exchange for food and medicine. He proved that in the nuclear age, the lawyer is often as lethal as the soldier. Donovan died in 1970, a quiet titan of diplomacy who had saved thousands of lives simply by refusing to accept that enemies could not talk to each other. But the most chilling legacy of the hollow nickel case is not in the past. It is in the present. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the illegal program that Rudolf Abel pioneered did not die with it. It merely evolved. In June 2010, the ghost of Rudolf Abel returned to New York. The FBI arrested 10 Russian sleeper agents as part of Operation Ghost Stories. These were the modern children of Abel. They lived in American suburbs. They had American names like Richard and Cynthia Murphy. They worked in finance and real estate, and they grew hydrangeas in their gardens. But at night, they communicated with Moscow. Instead of hollow nickels, they used digital steganography, hiding encrypted text files inside the pixels of digital photographs posted on benign public websites. The parallels between the 2010 ring and Abel's 1950s network were absolute. Like Abel, they were illegals without diplomatic cover. Like Abel, they were tasked with burrowing deep into American society to cultivate contacts. And like Abel, they were caught and exchanged. On a tarmac in Vienna in July 2010, the United States and Russia conducted a spy swap that was a direct visual echo of the Glienicke Bridge. The players had changed. The technology had moved from microfilm to pixels, but the game remained identical. The arrest of Anna Chapman and her colleagues proved that the lesson of the hollow nickel had never been forgotten in Moscow. The most effective spy is the one who looks exactly like your neighbor. And what of Jimmy Bozart, the paperboy who started it all? He grew up, lived a normal life, and eventually passed away, largely anonymous to the millions of people whose lives were arguably safer because of his clumsiness. He never sought fame. He never wrote a book. He was a symbol of the citizen counterintelligence that the Cold War relied on, the idea that freedom depends on vigilance, even the vigilance of a teenager collecting dimes. His story serves as a reminder of the fragility of conspiracy. William Fischer had trained for decades. He was a genius of tradecraft, a master of languages, a colonel of the KGB. He had the backing of a superpower. And he was defeated by gravity and a loose grip. The hollow nickel itself sits in the FBI museum today. It is small, tarnished, and unassuming. You could walk past it without noticing, just as thousands of New Yorkers walked past the spies who carried it. But that tiny piece of machined metal represents the ultimate paradox of the Cold War. Two superpowers spent trillions of dollars on nuclear bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and satellite constellations. They built armies of millions and threatened to burn the world to ash. And yet, the decisive battles were often fought with 5-cent coins, wooden pencils, and hollow bolts. The story of the hollow nickel is a testament to the fact that no secret is perfectly safe, because the world is full of friction. History doesn't always turn on the decisions of presidents or the movements of armies. Sometimes it turns on the sound of loose change hitting a concrete floor on a hot afternoon in Brooklyn. It is a warning that in the world of shadows, the smallest mistake can bring down the biggest empire, and that sometimes the fate of nations rests in the pocket of a 13-year-old boy who just wants to finish his paper route.